Chapter 3 The Dialectic of History. Everything I have said so far concerns only Montesquieu's method, its presuppositions and meaning. This method applied to his object is indisputably novel. But a method, even a novel one, may be in vain if it fails to produce anything new. What then are Montesquieu's positive discoveries? Have first of all considered mankind, and the result of my thoughts has been, that, amidst such an infinite diversity of laws and manners, they were not solely conducted by the caprice of fancy. I have laid down the first principles, and have found that the particular cases apply naturally to them, that the histories of all nations are only consequences of them, and that every particular law is connected with another law, or depends on some other of a more general extent. S.L. Preface. Such is Montesquieu's discovery, not particular ingenuities but universal first principles making intelligible the whole of human history and all its particulars. When once I had discovered my first principles, everything I sought for appeared. Ibid. What then are the principles which make history intelligible in this way? Once posed, this question raises a number of difficulties which directly involve the makeup of the spirit of laws. Montesquieu's great work, which opens with the pages I have just been discussing, does not indeed have the expected arrangement. First of all, from Book I to Book XM, it contains a theory of governments and of the different laws that depend either on their natures or on their principles. In other words, a typology, which appears very abstract, although it is crammed with historical examples, and seems to constitute a whole isolated from the rest, for a complete masterpiece within an incomplete masterpiece. J. Chevalier. After Book XN we seem to enter another world. Everything should have been said about the governments, their types being known, but here we have the climate, books 14, 15, 16, 16I, then the quality of the soil, books villi, then manners and morals, book 19, and commerce, books 20, 21, and money, book 22, and population, book XXM, and finally religion, books 24, 25, which each in turn determine the laws whose secret has apparently already been provided. And to cap the confusion, 4 books of history, one discussing the development of the Roman laws of succession, book XXV2, 3 expounding the origins of feudal laws, books XXVII, 30, 30I, and between them one book on the manner of composing laws, book 20IX. Principles which claim to provide order for history ought at least to put some of it in the treatise which expounds them. Where indeed are they to be found? The spirit of Lamb seems to be made up of 3 parts added onto one another, like ideas which have come up and that one does not want to lose. Where is the clear unity we expected? Should we seek Montesquieu's principles in the first 13 books, and thus show him the idea of a pure typology of the forms of government, the description of their peculiar dynamic, the deduction of laws as a function of their nature and principle? Suppose we agree. But then all the material about climate and the various factors, then the history, seem interesting certainly, but additional. Are the true principles on the contrary in the second part, in the idea that the laws are determined by different factors, some material, climate, soil, population, economy, others moral, manners and morals, religion? But then what is the concealed argument linking these determinate principles with the first ideal principles and the final historical studies? Any attempt to maintain the whole in an impossible unity, the ideality of the types, the determinism of the material or moral environment, and the history, falls into irresolvable contradictions. Montesquieu could be said to be torn between a mechanistic materialism and a moral idealism, between Montesquieu, Politics and History 45, a temporal structures and a historical genesis, etc., which is a way of saying that if he did make certain discoveries, they are only linked by the disorder of his book, which proves against him that he did not make the particular discovery he thought he had made. I should like to try to combat this impression and reveal between the different truths of the spirit of Lamb the chain that links them to other truths discussed in the preface. The first expression of Montesquieu's new principles is to be found in the few lines which distinguish between the nature and the principle of a government. Each government, republic, monarchy, despotism, has its nature and its principle. Its nature is that by which it is constituted, its principle the passion by which it is made to act. What is to be understood by the nature of a government? The nature of the government answers the question, who holds power? How does the holder of power exercise that power? Thus, the nature of republican government implies that the body of the nation, or a part of the nation, has sovereign authority. The nature of monarchical government, that one alone governs, but by fixed and established laws. The nature of despotism, that one alone governs, but with neither laws nor rules. The retention and mode of exercise of power, all this remains purely legal, and when all is said and done, formal. The principle takes us into life. For a government is not a pure form. It is the concrete form of existence of a society of men. For the men subject to a particular type of government to be precisely and lastingly subject to it, the mere imposition of a political form, nature, is not enough. They must also have a disposition to that form, a certain way of acting and reacting which will underpin that form. As Montesquieu puts it, there has to be a specific passion. Each form of government necessarily desires its own passion. The republic wants virtue, monarchy honor, and despotism fear. The principle of a government is drawn from its form, for it is a natural derivation of it. But this consequence is less its effect than its precondition. Take the example of the republic. The principle of the republic, virtue, answers the question, on 46, what condition can there be a government which gives power to the people and makes it exercise that power by the laws, on the condition that the citizens are virtuous, i.e. sacrifice themselves to the public good, and, in all circumstances, prefer the fatherland to their own passions. The same for monarchy and despotism. If the principle of the government is its springs that which makes it act, that is because it is, as the life of the government, quite simply its condition of existence. The republic will only go, to coin a phrase, on virtue, just as some motors will only go on petrol. Without virtue the republic will fall, as will monarchy without honor, despotism without fear. Montesquieu has been accused of formalism because of his way of defining a government by its nature, which does indeed consist of a few words of pure constitutional law. But it is forgotten that the nature of a government is formal for Montesquieu himself so long as it is separated from its principle. One should say, in a government a nature without a principle is inconceivable and non-existent. Only the nature-principle totality is conceivable, because it is real. And this totality is no longer formal, for it no longer designates a purely juridical form, but a political form engaged in its own life, in its own conditions of existence and survival. Although defined in one word, virtue, honor, fear, these conditions are highly concrete. Like passion in general, the passions may seem abstract, but as principles they express politically the whole real life of the citizens. The virtue of the citizen is his entire life devoted to the public good. This passion, dominating the state, is, in one man, all his passions dominated. With the principle it is the concrete life of men, public and even private, that enters into the government. The principle is thus the intersection of the nature of the government, its political form, with the real life of men. It is thus the point and aspect in which the real life of men has to be resumed in order to be inserted into the form of a government. The principle is the concrete of that abstract, the nature. It is their unity, it is their totality, that is real. Where is the formalism? This point will be conceded. But it is decisive if we are to grasp the full extent of Montesquieu's discovery. In this idea of the Montesquieu, Politics and History 47 totality of the nature and the principle of a government, Montesquieu is in fact proposing a new theoretical category, one which gives him the key to an infinity of riddles. Before him political theorists had certainly tried to explain the multiplicity and diversity of the laws of a given government. But they had done little more than outline a logic of the nature of governments, even when they were not, as in most cases, satisfied by a mere description of elements without any inner unity. The immense majority of laws, such as those that determine education, division of lands, degree of property, techniques of justice, punishments and rewards, luxury, the condition of women, the conduct of war, etc. sl. Forvely, were excluded from this logic, because their necessity was not understood. Montesquieu here majestically closes this whole debate, by discovering and verifying in the facts the hypothesis that the state's a real totality and that all the particulars of its legislation, of its institutions and its customs are merely the effect and expression of its inner unity. He submits these laws, which seem fortuitous and irrational, to a profound logic, and relates them to a single center. I do not claim that Montesquieu was the first to think that the state should of itself constitute a totality. This idea is already lurking in Plato's reflection, and we find it again at work in the thought of the theoreticians of natural law, at any rate in Hobbes. But before Montesquieu this idea only entered into the constitution of an ideal state, without lowering itself to the point of making concrete history intelligible. With Montesquieu, the totality, which was an idea, becomes a scientific hypothesis, intended to explain the facts. It becomes the fundamental category which makes it possible to think, no longer the reality of an ideal state, but the concrete and hitherto unintelligible diversity of the institutions of human history. History is no longer that infinite space in which are haphazardly scattered the innumerable works of caprice and accident, to the discouragement of the understanding, whose only possible conclusion is the insignificance of man and the greatness of God. This space has a structure. It possesses concrete centers to which are related a whole local horizon of facts and institutions, the states. And at the core of these totalities, 48 which are like living individuals, there is an inner reason, an inner unity, a fundamental primordial center, the unity of nature and principle. Hegel, who gave the category of the totality enormous scope, well knew his own teacher when he expressed his gratitude for this discovery to Montesquieu's genius. Here, however, formalism is still lying in wait for us. For it may well be that this category of the totality constituted the unity of the first books of the spirit of laws. But it may be said that it is restricted to them, and that it is marked by the error of these first books, that it concerns pure models, a truly republican republic, a truly monarchical monarchy and a truly despotic despotism only. In Reflections on the preceding chapters, S.L. M. N., Montesquieu says, such are the principles of the three sorts of government, which does not imply, that, in a particular republic, they actually are, but that they ought to be, virtuous, nor does it prove, that, in a particular monarchy, they are actuated by honor, or, in a particular despotic government, by fear, but that they ought to be directed by these principles, otherwise the government is imperfect. Is this not to prove that an idea which is only valid for pure models and perfect political forms has been taken for a category applicable to all existing governments? Is it not to relapse into a theory of essences and into the ideal trap which was precisely what was to be avoided? Whereas one must, as a historian, necessarily explain a certain very imperfect republic or monarchy, not a pure republic or monarchy? If the totality is only valid for the purity, what use is the totality in history, which is impurity itself? Or, and this is the same aporia, how can one ever think history in a category attached in essence to pure temporal models? We have come back to the difficulty of the disparity of the spirit of laws, how to unite the beginning and the end, the pure typology and the history. I believe we should be careful not to judge Montesquieu by one sentence, but, as he forewarns us, take his work as a whole, without separating what he says in it from what he does. It is indeed very remarkable that this theoretician of pure models never, or hardly ever, in his work gives any but impure examples. Montesquieu, Politics and History foregrounds even in the history of Rome, which is for him truly the most perfect experimental subject, a kind of pure substance of historical experimentation. The ideal purity only had one moment, at the beginning. For all the rest of the time Rome lived in political impurity. It would surely be incredible if Montesquieu were unaware of such a contradiction. It must be that he does not think he is contradicting his principles, but that he is giving them a more profound meaning than they are attributed. I believe in fact that the category of the totality, and the nature principle unity which is its core, is indeed a universal category, one which does not concern just the perfect adequacies, republic virtue, monarchy honor, despotism fear. Manifestly, Montesquieu considers that in any state, whether it is pure or impure, the law of this totality and its unity is supreme. If the state is pure, the unity will be an adequate one. But if it is impure, it will be a contradictory one. All the impure majority of Montesquieu's historical examples are so many examples of this contradictory unity. Thus Rome, once the first period is over, and the first great conquests have occurred, lives in the state of a republic which will loses and then has lost its principle, virtue. To say that therefore the nature-principle unity always survives but has become a contradiction is quite simply to state that it is the relationship existing between the political form of a government and the passion then providing it with a content which governs the fate of that state, its life, its survival, its future, and hence its historical essence. If this relationship is a non-contradictory one, i.e. if the republican form finds virtue in the man it governs, the republic will survive. But if this republican form is now only imposed on men who have abdicated all virtue and relapsed into private interests and passions, etc., then the relation will be a contradictory one. But it is precisely this contradiction in the relation, i.e. the existing contradictory relation, that decides the fate of the republic. It will perish. All this can be inferred from Montesquieu's historical studies, and in particular from considerations on the causes of the grandeur and declension of the Roman Empire, but it is also clearly stated in Book Viii of the Spirit of Laws, which deals with the corruption 5 degrees of governments. To say, as Montesquieu does, that a government which loses its principle is a lost government means quite clearly that the nature-principle unity is also supreme in the impure cases. If it were not, it would be impossible to understand how this broken unity could break its government. Hence it is a strange mistake to doubt that Montesquieu has a sense of history, or to suspect that his typology diverted him from a theory of history, that he wrote books on history through a distraction which led him away from his principles. This mistake is no doubt rooted primarily in the fact that Montesquieu did not share the already widespread and soon-to-be dominant ideology, the belief that history has an end, is in pursuit of the realm of reason, liberty and enlightenment. Montesquieu was probably the first person before Marx who undertook to think history without attributing to it an end, i.e. without projecting the consciousness of men and their hopes onto the time of history. This criticism is thus entirely to his credit. He was the first to propose a positive principle of universal explanation for history, a principle which is not just static, the totality explaining the diversity of the laws and institutions of a given government, but also dynamic, the law of the unity of nature and principle, a law making it possible to think the development of institutions and their transformations in real history, too. In the depth of the countless laws which come and go, he thus discovered a constant connection uniting the nature of a government to its principle, and at the core of this constant connection, he stated the inner variation of the relation, which, by the transitions of the unity from adequacy to inadequacy, from identity to contradiction, makes intelligible the changes and revolutions in the concrete totalities of history. But Montesquieu was also the first to give an answer to a question which has become classic, the question of the motor of history. Let us look again at the law of historical development. It is completely governed by the relation existing between the nature and the principle in their very unity. If these two terms are in harmony, republican Rome and virtuous Romans, the totality of the state is peaceful, man even a history without crises. If the Montesquieu, politics and history 5, two terms are in contradiction, republican Rome and Romans who have abandoned virtue, crisis breaks out. The principle is then no longer what is wanted by the nature of the government. Whence a chain reaction, the form of the government tries blindly to reduce the contradiction, it changes, and its change drags the principle along with it, until, with the help of circumstances, a new harmony emerges, imperial despotic Rome and Romans living in fear, or a catastrophe which is the end of this breathless chase, barbarian conquest. The dialectic of this process is quite clear. Its extreme moments are, either peace between the two terms of the opposition, or their conflict. In their conflict, the interaction of the terms is clear, as is how each modification of one inevitably induces a modification of the other. Thus it is clear that nature and principle are absolutely interdependent in the mobile but pregnant totality of the state. But it is not clear where the first change comes from, nor the last one, either in the order of time, or in that of causes. It is not clear which of these two terms linked together in the fate of the totality is the preponderant one. In his work on the philosophy of the Enlightenment, Ernst Cassirer praises Montesquieu for having thus founded a quite modern comprehensive theory of history, i.e. for having thought history within the category of the totality, and the elements of this totality in a specific unity, while precisely renouncing the idea that one element might be more important than the others, i.e. that there might be a motor of history. History is simply a moving totality, whose unity can be understood and the meaning of whose inner movements can be grasped, but which can never be explained, i.e. its interactional movements can never be related to a determinate element. And in fact this view seems to accord with the letter of many passages from Montesquieu, who constantly turns from the form of the government to its principle, and from its principle to its form. It is the republican laws that produce the very virtue that enables them to be republican, the monarchical institutions that engender the honor that underpins them. As honor is for nobility, the principle is both father and child of the five form of government. That is why every particular form produces in its principle its own conditions of existence, and always forestalls itself, although at the same time it is the principle which is expressed in that form. We would seem here to be in a real circular expressive totality in which each part is like the whole, pars totalis. And the movement of this sphere which we think is moved by a cause is no more than its displacement onto itself. With a rolling ball, each point on its sphere can move from top to bottom and return from there to the top, go back down again, and so on to infinity. But all its points do the same. There is neither top nor bottom in a sphere, entirely contained as it is in each of its points. However, I believe that this slightly over-modern intuition does not express Montesquieu's most profound thought. For he intends there to be in the last instance a determinate term, the principle. The force of the principles draws everything to it. Such is the grand lesson of Book VM, which opens with the sentence, "The corruption of each government generally begins with that of the principles." Corruption, and thus the impure state I have been discussing, constitutes a sort of experimental situation which makes it possible to penetrate the indivisible nature-principle unity and decide which is the decisive element of the opposition. The result is that it is definitely the principle that governs the nature and gives it its meaning. When once the principles of government are corrupted, the very best laws become bad, and turn against the state, but, when the principles are sound, even bad laws have the same effect as good, SLVMN, a state may alter two different ways, either by the amendment, or by the corruption, of the Constitution. If it has preserved its principles, and the Constitution changes, this is owing to its amendment. If, upon changing the Constitution, its principles are lost, this means that it has been corrupted. This clearly shows the transition from the case of the experimental situation of corruption to the general case of any modification, to the good as well as to the bad, in the nature of the state. Thus it really is the principle Montesquieu, politics and history which is, in the last resort, the cause of the development of forms and their meanings. To the point that the classic image of form and content, form being what informs, effectivity itself, has to be inverted. It is the principle that is, in this sense, the true form of that apparent form, the nature of the government. There are very few laws which are not good, while the state retains its principles. Here I may apply what Epicurus said of riches: it is not the liquor, but the vessel, that is corrupted. SLVMN. Of course, this does not exclude the effectivity of the nature on the principle, but within certain limits. Otherwise it would be difficult to understand how Montesquieu could have imagined laws intended to preserve or reinforce the principle. The urgency of these laws is simply a confession of their subordinate character. They are only active in a domain which may escape them not only for 1,000 accidental and external reasons, but also and above all for the fundamental reason that it reigns over them and decides even what they mean. There are thus limited situations in which laws that are intended to provide manners and morals are powerless against manners and morals themselves, and rebound against the end that they were supposed to serve, the manners and morals rejecting laws opposed to their own goals. However hazardous a comparison it may be, and one that I put forward with all possible precautions, the type of this determination in the last instance by the principle, determination which nevertheless farms out a whole zone of subordinate effectivity to the nature of the government, can be compared with the type of determination which Marx attributes in the last instance to the economy, a determination which nevertheless farms out a zone of subordinate effectivity to politics. In both cases it is a matter of a unity which may be harmonious or contradictory. In both cases this determination does nonetheless cede to the determined element a whole region of effectivity, but subordinate effectivity. Hence this interpretation reveals a real unity between the first and last parts of the spirit of laws, between the typology and the history. But there remains one difficulty, the so varied second part, which introduces climate, soil, commerce, religion. Surely 5-4 it represents new principles, and heteroclite ones, which clash with the unity I have just demonstrated. Let us first run through the new determinant factor suggested to us. Before climate, Book 14, there is another important element, referred to on several occasions, and particularly in Book 8, the dimensions of the state. The nature of a government depends on the geographical extent of its empire. A minute state will be republican, a moderate state monarchic, and an immense state despotic. Here is a determination that seems to overthrow the laws of history, since geography decides its forms directly. Climate reinforces this argument, since this time it is the temperature of the air that distributes the empires, despotisms beneath violent skies, moderate governments beneath tender ones, and decides in advance which men will be free and which slaves. we learn that the empire of the climate is the first, the most powerful of all empires, but at the same time that this empire can be conquered by well-conceived laws leaning on its excesses to protect men from its effects. A new cause then appears: the nature of the soil occupied by a nation. According to whether it is fertile or arid, the government there will be a government of one man or of many; according to whether it is mountainous or a plain, a continent or an island, liberty or slavery will be found to triumph there. But here again the causality invoked can be counteracted. Countries are not cultivated in proportion to their fertility, but to their liberty. But here are the manners and morals, mores, or general spirit of a nation, which add their effectivities to the others, then commerce and money, and finally religion. It is hard to avoid an impression of disorder, as if Montesquieu wanted to exhaust a series of principles he has discovered separately and then heaped together for want of any better order. Mankind are influenced by various causes, by the climate, by the religion, by the laws, by the maxims of government, by precedents, morals, and customs. The unity of a profound law has turned into a plurality of causes. The totality is lost in a list. I do not want to make it look as if I hoped to save Montesquieu, Politics say in History 55 from himself by forcing this disorder to appear as an order. But I should like to suggest briefly that in this disorder we can often glimpse something approaching an order which is not foreign to what has so far been established. What is indeed remarkable in the majority of these factors, which either determine the very nature of the government, for example geographical extent, climate, soil, or a certain number of its laws, is the fact that they only act on their object indirectly. Take the example of the climate. The torrid climate does not produce the despot just like that, nor does the temperate the monarch. The climate only acts on the temperament of men, by way of a nice physiology which dilates or contracts the extremities and thereby affects the global sensitivity of the individual, imprinting on him peculiar needs and leanings, down to his style of conduct. It is the men thus constituted and conditioned who are apt for particular laws and governments. It is the variety of wants, in different climates, that first occasioned a difference in the manner of living, and thus gave rise to a variety of laws. The laws produced by the climate are thus the last effect in the whole chain, whose penultimate link, the product of the climate and the cause of the laws, is the customary life, manière de vivre, which is the outside of the manners and morals, mores. SL 19:16. Look at the soil. If fertile lands are good for the government of one man alone, that is because the peasant there is too busy and too well paid by his efforts to raise his nose from the ground and his pence. Commerce, it does not act directly on the laws but via the intermediary of the manners. Wherever there is commerce, there we meet with agreeable manners. SL 20. Hence the peaceful spirit of commerce, its suitability to certain governments, its repugnance for others. As for religion itself, it seems to be part of another world than these completely material factors, but it acts nonetheless in the same way, by giving a nation ways of living the law and practicing morality. It only concerns government through the behavior of citizens and subjects. It is its mastery of fear that makes the Mahometan religion so apt for despotism. It provides it with slaves, ripe for slavery. It is its mastery of morality that 56 makes the Christian religion accord so well with moderate government. We owe to Christianity, in government, a certain political law, and in war, a certain law of nations. Thus just when they are acting on the government and determining certain of its essential laws, all these causes, apparently so radically disparate, converge on a common point, the customs, morals and manners of being, feeling and acting that they confer on the men who live within their empire. From their conjunction arises what Montesquieu calls the spirit of a nation. He does right. Mankind are influenced by various causes, by the climate, by the religion, etc., but only so as to conclude, from whence is formed the general spirit of the nation. Hence it is the result, the manners and morals, the general spirit of a nation, which determines either the form of the government or a certain number of its laws. The question then arises, is this not an already familiar determination? Indeed, remember what I have said of the principle of a government and of the depths of the concrete life of men it expresses. Consider not from the viewpoint of the form of the government, i.e. of its political exigencies, but from the viewpoint of its content, i.e. of its origins. The principle is really the political expression of the concrete behavior of men, i.e. of their manners and morals, and spirit. Of course, Montesquieu does not say in so many words that the manners and morals or spirit of a nation constitute the very essence of the principle of its government. But he does set out from principles as the pure forms of the government. Their truth appears in their corruption. When the principle is lost, it is clear that manners and morals effectively take the place of principle, that they are its loss or salvation. Take the Republic, abandoned by virtue, there is no longer any respect for magistrates there, nor for old age, nor even for husbands. No longer will there be any such things as manners, order, or virtue. It would be hard to say more clearly that the principle, virtue, is simply the expression of the manners. Look at Rome, in its trials and reverses, with events shaking all the forms, it held fast. Rome. Montesquieu, Politics and History. 57 was a ship held by two anchors, religion and manners, in the midst of a furious tempest. Finally, look at modern states. Most of the European nations are still governed by manners and morals, which is what saves them from despotism, partly already master of their laws. How can it be doubted that the manners and morals, vaster and more extensive than the principle, are nonetheless its real foundation and seat, when the same dialectic can be seen outlined between the manners and morals and the laws as between the principles and the nature of a government? Laws are established, manners are inspired, these proceed from a general spirit, those from a particular institution. Now, it is as dangerous, nay, more so, to subvert the general spirit as to change a particular institution. It is hard to see why it would be more dangerous to change the manners and morals than the laws if the manners and morals did not have the same advantage over the laws as the principle has over the nature, that of determining them in the last resort. 1 Hence the idea that recurs so frequently of a sort of primitive virtue of manners and morals. If a people always knows, loves and defends its manners more than its laws, that is because these manners are more profound and primordial. Thus, among the earliest Romans, their manners were sufficient to secure the fidelity of their slaves, so that there was no necessity for laws. Later, As they then wanted manners and morals, they had need of laws. And among primitive peoples themselves, if manners precede laws and standing for them, that is because in some sense they derive their origin from nature. The form and style of conduct which are expressed politically in the principle can be reduced to this ultimate basis. This ultimate basis whose essential components Montesquieu lists as the climate, the soil, the religion, etc. In all societies, which are simply a union of minds, a common character is formed. This universal soul adopts a way of thinking which is the effect of a chain of infinite causes which multiply and combine century by century. Once the tone has been given and received, it alone governs, and everything that sovereigns, magistrates, and peoples may do or imagine, whether it seems to conflict with the tone or to follow it, always relates to it, and it dominates even the total destruction of the society. Mes pensées. As it seems to me that this substantial analogy between the manners and morals and the principle also explains the strange circular causality of these factors, which seem at first sight completely mechanical. It is true that the climate and the soil, etc., determine certain laws, but they can be counteracted by them, and all the art of the enlightened legislator consists of playing on this necessity in order to beat it. If this recourse is possible, it is because this determination is not direct but indirect, and that it is completely gathered together and concentrated in the manners and spirit of a nation, entering via the principle, which is the political abstraction and expression of the manners and morals, into the totality of the state. But since within this totality there is a certain possible action of the nature on the principle, and hence of the laws on the manners and morals and consequently on their components and causes, it is not surprising that climate may give way to the laws. I know that counter-quotations will be used against me and that I shall be accused of giving Montesquieu the benefit of the doubt. However, it seems to me that all the reservations one might express turn on no more than a single point, the ambiguity of the concepts of principle and manners and morals. But I believe that this ambiguity is real in Montesquieu himself. I should say that it expresses simultaneously his wish to introduce the utmost clarity and necessity into history, but also in some sense his inability, not to speak of his choice. For if the region of the nature of a government is always perfectly sharply defined, if the dialectic of the nature principle unity and contradiction, and the thesis of the primacy of principle, both emerge clearly from his examples, the concept of principle and the concept of manners and morals remain vague. I said that the principle expresses the condition of existence of a government, and has the real life of men as its concrete background. The parallel causalities of the second part of the spirit of laws reveal to us the components of this real life, i.e. the real material and moral conditions of the existence of a government, and summarize them in the manners and morals which come to Montesquieu, Politics and History 59, the surface in the principle. But it is hard to see the transition from the manners and morals to the principle, from the real conditions to the political exigencies of the form of a government, which come together in the principle. The very terms I used, such as the manners being expressed in the principles, betray this difficulty, for this expression is in some sense torn between its origin, the manners and morals, and the exigencies of its end, the form of the government. All Montesquieu's ambiguity is linked to this tension. He did feel that the necessity of history could only be thought in the unity of its forms and their conditions of existence, and in the dialectic of that unity. But he grouped all these conditions, on the one hand in the manners and morals, which are indeed produced by real conditions, but whose concept remains vague. The synthesis of all these conditions in the manners and morals is no more than cumulative, and on the other hand in the principle, which, divided between its real origins and the exigencies of the political form it has to animate, leans too often towards these exigencies alone. It will be said that this contradiction and this ambiguity are inevitable in a man who thinks in the concepts of his period and cannot transcend the limits of the then established knowledges, simply interrelating what he knows, and unable to seek in the conditions he is describing a deeper unity, which would presuppose a complete political economy. To that is true. And it is already remarkable that Montesquieu should have defined and designated in advance in a brilliant conception of history an as yet obscure zone barely illuminated by a vague concept, the zone of manners and morals, mores, and behind it the zone of the concrete behavior of men in their relations with nature and with their past. But within him another man and the scientist took advantage of this ambiguity. The man of a political party which needed to see Voltaire already. Montesquieu had no knowledge of the political principles relating to wealth, manufactures, finances and commerce. These principles had not yet been discovered. It would have been as impossible for him to make the spirit of laws, Smith's treatise on wealth, as Newton's mathematical principles. 6. So precisely the preeminence of the forms over their principles, and wanted there to be three kinds of government, in order that, protected by the necessities of climate, manners and morals, and religion, it could make its choice between them. Chapter 4. There are three governments. There are thus three species of government: the republic, monarchy and despotism. These totalities should be closely examined. I. The republic. I hope to be very brief on the republic. Faget may have said that Montesquieu is a republican. Montesquieu does not believe in the republic, and for a simple reason: the age of republics is past. Republics only last in small states. Our era is that of medium and large empires. Republics can only be sustained by virtue and frugality, general mediocrity in its original sense, i.e. that everybody is content with nothing. Our age is one of luxury and commerce. Virtue has become such a burden that its effects would be disastrous if they could not be attenuated by milder laws. For all these reasons, the republic retreats into the distant past, Greece, Rome. No doubt that is why it is so beautiful. Montesquieu, who is quite prepared to call Richelieu crazy for his claim to want an angel for king, so rare is virtue, accepts that in Greece and Rome there were, at certain periods, enough angels to make up whole cities. This political angelicism makes democracy, for here I shall ignore aristocracy, which is an unstable mixture of democracy and monarchy, an exceptional regime, a kind of synthesis of all the exigencies of politics. First, it is truly a political regime, by which I mean a regime which attains the true sphere of politics, that of stability and universality. In democracy, the men who are 62 everything are nonetheless not at the mercy of their own caprice. The citizens are not so many despots. Their omnipotence subordinates them to a political order and a political structure which they recognize and which transcend them as individual men. The order of the laws, whether fundamental, i.e. constitutive of the regime, or occasional, i.e. decreed in response to events. But this order itself, which makes them citizens, is not an order received from without, as for example is the feudal order, the natural inequality of the estates in a monarchy. In democracy, the citizens possess the unique privilege of themselves consciously and voluntarily producing in legislation the very order which governs them. Children of the laws, they are also their fathers. They are subjects only as sovereigns. They are masters subject to their own power. It is clear that this synthesis of subject and sovereign in the citizen, which haunted Rousseau, demands of man that he be more than man, and that without being quite an angel, he be a citizen, which is the true angel of public life. This category of the citizen realizes the synthesis of the state in man himself. The citizen is the state in the private man. That is why education has such an important place in the economy of this regime, for Montesquieu as well as for Rousseau. Montesquieu shows that democracy cannot tolerate the division of education characteristic of monarchic regimes. In fact, modern man is torn between two educations, that of his fathers and teachers on the one hand, and that of the world on the other. The one preaches him morality and religion, the other never to forget himself. And what Hegel was to call the law of the world, which governs real human relations, triumphs over the law of the heart, whose refuge is the hearth and the church. None of this in a democratic regime. Family, school and life speak the same language. The whole of life is simply an endless education. For, in its very essence, democracy presupposes, behind this endless discipline and edification which is in some sense its temporal form, a true conversion of the private man into the public man. If in democracy all private vices are public crimes, which is the justification for the censors, if civil law is identical with political Montesquieu, politics and history 63 law, that is because all of a man's private life consists of being a public man, the laws being the perpetual reminder of this exigency. This circle of democracy, which is simply the eternal education of democracy, this remarkable circle of a regime which thus accepts its existence as a perpetual task, realizes the specific duty of the citizens, who, in order to be all as they are in the state, must, in their very persons, become all of the state. A moral conversion? That is what Montesquieu proposes when he depicts virtue, although it is entirely political, as the preference of the public good over private good, as self-forgetfulness, as the triumph of reason over passion. But this moral conversion is not that of an isolated conscience, it is that of a state totally steeped in this duty, translated into laws. With its laws, the Republic, which wants citizens, takes care to force them into virtue. At what cost can this virtue be thus forced? At the cost of an archaic economy maintained in its past, at the cost of manners and morals carefully guarded by the laws, the aged and the censors, lastly, and above all, at the cost of judicious political measures, which only aim to edify the people in order to maintain it within the power of its notables. Indeed, what is striking in the entirely retrospective apologia for the people's government constituted by democracy, Aristocracy is much less exemplary, because, dare I say it, it is founded from the outset on the division of the people, is the care taken to distinguish two peoples within the people. When Montesquieu's Republic is compared with Rousseau's, and the virtue of the one with the virtue of the other, it must not be forgotten that the former is in the past and the latter in the future, the latter a people's republic, the former a republic of notables. Hence the importance of the problem of popular representation. Rousseau has no intention that the people should legislate through its representatives. Sovereignty, for the same reason as makes it inalienable, cannot be represented. It lies essentially in the general will, and will does not admit of representation. 1. A democracy which adopts repri. Rousseau, The Social Contract, and Discourses, Op. Cit. p. 78. 64 Sensitives is on its deathbed. Montesquieu, on the contrary, holds that a democracy without representatives is an imminent popular despotism. This is because he has a very special idea of the people, confirmed by those ancient democracies in which the freedom of the freemen was to the forefront, leaving the multitude of artisans and slaves in the shade. Montesquieu does not want this common people, bas peuple, to have power. 2. This is indeed his most deep-lying concern, and it illuminates all the precautions of Book 2. Abandoned to itself, the people, the common people, is nothing but passion. It is incapable of foresight, thought and judgment. How could passion judge, since it is the very absence of reason? Let the people therefore be deprived of all direct power, but let them choose representatives. They are extremely well qualified for choosing, for they see men in action at close quarters, and discern the good and the mediocre instantly. They know how to choose the good general, the good rich man and the good judge. They see the first in his wars, the second in his banquets and the third in his judgments. They have a natural capacity, in respect to the discernment of merit, and as proof that merit stares them in the face, though the people of Rome assumed to themselves the right of raising plebeians to public offices, yet they would never exert this power, and though, at Athens, the magistrates were allowed, by the law of Aristides, to be elected from all the different classes of inhabitants, there never was a case, said Xenophon, that the common people petitioned for employments which could endanger either their security or their glory. What a wonderful natural gift of the people, forcing them to admit their own inability even to be their own masters, and to take for lords precisely those who have the advantages of rank and fortune over them. Ancient democracy itself thus already witnesses in favor of all the notables of history. Thus in democracy there is available what is required to reign too. There is nothing in the world more insolent than republics. The common people is the most insolent tyrant there can be. Voyages. Force this judicious inclination and, if all else fails, what is required to admonish it and establish it in its vocation. In particular, there are laws which divide the people into classes, with enough discrimination to deprive the commoners of their votes. It is in the manner of making this division that great legislators have signalized themselves. Servius Tullius, for example, had the wit to lodge the right of suffrage in the hands of the principal citizens, so that it was property rather than numbers that decided the elections. Or the Roman legislators who realized that the public vote should be considered as a fundamental law of democracy, for, the lower classes ought to be directed by those of higher rank, and restrained within bounds by the gravity of eminent personages. SL 11, 2. Voting secretly is a privilege of the aristocratic seigneury, for the reason that they are themselves their own great men. No doubt but that the surest means of maintaining such a natural disposition is to produce it. Carefully confined to the past by the enlargement of modern states and the turn of events which has made virtue inhuman, democracy therefore only relates to the present by the lessons of experience that descend from it. Even in a popular government, the power ought not to fall into the hands of the common people. 2. Monarchy. With monarchy and despotism, which is in some sense its inverse and pole of attraction, we are in the present. Montesquieu thinks that modern times belong to feudal monarchy, and the feudal monarchy belongs to modern times. Antiquity knew no real monarchies. In Rome, as we know, the republic was what was hidden in its trappings, for two reasons, which their conjunction will illuminate: because it was ignorant of the true distribution of powers and knew nothing of government by the nobility. What is monarchy? By its nature it is the government of a single person who directs the state by fixed and established laws. By its principle, it is the reign of honor. A single person who governs, the king. But what are these laws? Montesquieu, Politics and History 65-66, which have the privilege of being fixed and established. What is the meaning of this fixity and establishment? Here Montesquieu has in mind what jurists had for 3 centuries called the fundamental laws of the kingdom. The expression fundamental law often appears in the spirit of laws. Every government has its fundamental laws. Thus the Republic has, among others, the electoral law. Thus despotism has the nomination of a vizier by the despot. We even learn in passing that the colonial pact is the fundamental law of Europe vis-à-vis its overseas colonial possessions. Thus Montesquieu uses the expression in a very broad way, assigning to it the designation of those laws in a government that define and found its nature, in modern terms, its constitution, as distinct from the laws by which the government governs. But it is obvious that in the case of a monarchy this expression contains the echoes of past disputes. The object of these disputes was the definition of the powers of the absolute monarch. The notion of the fundamental laws of the kingdom intervened to limit the pretensions of the king. It demonstrated to him that he was king, by the grace of God no doubt, but also as an effect of laws older than him which he accepted tacitly by mounting the throne, the virtue of these laws seating him there even unbeknownst to him. The jurists usually cited the law of blood succession, but also a whole series of dispositions whose object was the recognition of the existing orders, nobility, clergy, parliament, etc. The fundamental laws which set the king on his throne demanded in return that the king respect them. It is to this meaning that Montesquieu is reverting under cover of a more general sense, when he talks of monarchy. Read carefully Book 11 Chapter 4. You will find that the first sentence identifies the nature of monarchical government, government by fundamental laws, and the intermediate, subordinate, and dependent powers. The intermediary powers are 2 in number, the nobility and the clergy, the nobility being the most natural of the 2. Those intermediary bodies are to be laws. Elsewhere Montesquieu cites as a fundamental law of monarchy the law of succession to the throne, which prevents intrigue on Montesquieu, Politics and History 67 the dissipation of power, not only on the death, but also during the youth of a prince. This law really is a law. He also invokes the necessity of a depository of the laws independent of the royal authority, and this really is a matter of a law establishing a political institution. But the nobility and the clergy, we were thinking of political institutions, and here we have the intervention of social orders. In fact the word lamb here only designates the privileged bodies in order to signify